we're going to go ahead and turn the time over to Lavinia. Lavinia works for USBE, and I will let her go ahead and introduce herself and kind of introduce what she's going to be presenting on.
Great. Well, welcome everyone and good morning. And thank you so much for allowing me to present at your meeting. Let me share my screen while I'm introducing myself. Hang on one second. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Great. So we're here today to talk about transition planning for students with disabilities and how counselors can be partners in that process for college and career readiness for students' success and post after school. My name is Lavinia Grippentrog. I'm one of the transition specialists here at the State Board of Education. I've been in the special ed section. I've been here about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a special educator and transition specialist in several different districts, most recently Murray School District. I spent a lot of years in Murray. And so I'd like to find out who else is in the room. If you wouldn't mind entering in the chat your LEA name and your job title. I guess you're all counseling leaderships in some form, and then the grades that you work with. That way it'll give me a little bit more background before we get started. So I will let you do that. Okay, great. Nebo, K through 12. San Juan, K through 12. Okay, great. Winter, Iron. Lake Granite. Yay, we got someone from Murray. Excellent, Alpine. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that information. And we'll go ahead and continue. So learning intentions today, I hope that by the end of our time together this morning that you will learn the importance of transition planning for students with disabilities to improve post-school outcomes. I hope that you'll be familiar with Utah's transition mandates and graduation guidelines for students with disabilities, and that you will know the services and resources available in Utah for students with disabilities. And hopefully you will then also become familiar with evidence-based predictors of post-school success for students with disabilities. So I'm going to give you a minute to kind of assess your level of knowledge. This will help me as well. How familiar are you with the concept of transition or transition planning for students with disabilities? So on a scale from 1 to 5, go ahead and put your level of knowledge in the chat. Okay. Great, looks like we have folks that have considerable knowledge. Awesome. So this, for some of you then, some of this might be a little bit of review, but for others, hopefully you will certainly come away with some new resources and knowledge after our session today. Thank you for your feedback. All right, so I'd like to start with this question. What is transition to you? It's just one small word. It's only a page in the student's IEP. It's a form, right? That's part of the IEP, but it really truly is so much more than that. So take a minute to type in the chat what pops into your mind when you hear transition or transition planning. So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and respond. So what words, what concepts, what activities maybe enter into your mind when you hear transition? Okay, college and career readiness, definitely part of transition. Yeah, preparing for that life after school, right? After the IEP ends, after the bus stop's coming, after high school's over. Definitely an important part of transition. I'm going to give a few more seconds to see if there's any additional responses. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. Here is my list, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. And we often leave this off, but transition really, it's so important, especially for students with disabilities, that this is a time that they kind of start to learn and understand their own disability, how to advocate for themselves, how to be self-determined, how to be involved in their transition planning and make choices about what they want to do for the rest of their life. It certainly is a plan for what's going to happen after high school. Somebody already put that into the chat. Along with that plan, it's learning how to set goals and action steps to realize their actual plans for after high school. It's a lot of change, not only change for the student, but oftentimes for the family, and especially for students with more significant disabilities, this can be really tough, right? When school ends, it's completely different, the world that their student is living in. So change can be especially challenging at this stage during transition. Another really big part of transition is that it really should be based on the student's interests, preferences, strengths, and needs. And this comes actually right out of the transition mandates in IDEA language, that we want to make sure that we are building on student strengths, that it's very much strengths-based, that we're taking into account the student's preference, interests, and needs, and how do those align with those post-secondary goals. Career exploration should be a large part of transition, really all of those activities that are involved in a student understanding themselves, their interests, their talents, and how that lends itself to certain careers, and how to begin to explore those and expand on those interests. And of course, adult living skills. And oftentimes we think of this as just something that is for our students with more complex needs, but really this is an important part. And I think sometimes we miss that adult living skills are some things that all of our students need before they leave our schools. And work experiences, we can't stress this enough. There's a lot of research that really points to having students having work experience while they're in high school. They are much more likely to have secured work after high school. So that's super important. And another piece of transition we sometimes forget about because we get so busy with what we're doing day to day in schools, but really that we should be the connector to outside agencies and adult services for that student and their families. It's often difficult to navigate all of these different services as a student enters into transition and leaves our school. So we want to make sure that we are well versed in our outside agency partners and community partners to kind of have that seamless connection for students and families. So I wasn't joking when I said there was a lot that falls under transition, even though it's just one word and often just one page in the IEP. There really is a lot going on when we talk about transition. So oftentimes students with disabilities might earn their diploma, but they don't necessarily have the skills and experiences to be successful in post-high. So just having that diploma doesn't necessarily mean that that's a ticket to a successful post-school outcome. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So you may or may not be familiar with our Utah Post-School Outcomes Survey process. This is also known as Indicator 14. We are required by the Office of Special Ed Programs to attempt to contact every former student that has left our LEAs with an IEP in place. So we actually attempt to call, it's about 5,000 students a year after they have left LEAs, to find out what they're engaged in. And then we have to actually report these data. So these are just kind of in a nutshell. I wanted to give you some idea of how our former students are doing a year after they leave us. And these are students that left high school with an IEP, and they either left graduating, aging out, dropping out, or with a certificate of completion. All of those students are considered exiters, and those are the students that we contact. So our latest data happened this summer. We do these phone calls and surveys in the summer. And of those results, we only had 20% of our students with disabilities successfully completing a semester of college. So that's a 2 or 4 year college. So only 20%. And that has remained, those data have remained pretty steady the last probably 5 or 7 years. We haven't seen that increase very much. 17% of our students with disabilities in Utah are not engaged in any type of further education and training or employment after high school. So that's a pretty large percentage of students that are either unengaged or underengaged a year after they've left. So that to me is kind of the more troubling set of data, is what are those, why are those students not engaged in some other training or education or employment? Then when we start to look at our post-school outcomes by disability category, and there's a website where you can actually look at all of these data from our state, but you can also drill down and kind of look at our different demographics. So just to give you some perspective, our students with intellectual disabilities, only 62% are engaged in some form of employment or further education and training. So that means about 40% or 4 out of 10 are also not engaged in any kind of employment or further education and training. And then our students with autism, 30% of students with autism are also not engaged at all after leaving high school. So we definitely have our work cut out for us, right? We need to have higher expectations and have better outcomes for our students with disabilities. So I'm going to later on put this URL or this website in the chat, but this is the public side of our Utah Post-School Outcomes Survey, where you can look at the data statewide, and also you can request an account if you're interested in looking at the data for your LEA specifically. And also you can drill down to the school level, individual high schools. You can look at those data separately if you'd like. So you might be asking this question, well, how can you, as in your position, support students with disabilities to improve their post-school outcomes? So if you'd like to enter something in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. These are some other questions that you might have, and if you have others, certainly you can put those in the chat as well. But you might be asking, well, what is my role in transition planning for students with disabilities? What resources can I bring to the table? How does the CCR plan align with the transition plan? And how do I provide counseling services for students with significant cognitive disabilities? So we're going to try to answer some of those questions today. And like I said, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put those in the chat at any time. So I think the kind of the big takeaways here is that we want to make sure that we're always holding high expectations for students with disabilities. I think this has kind of been a common theme throughout the disability world, is that we tend to have low expectations once a student is labeled with a disability. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining those high expectations for students with disabilities. Aligning the student CCR plan with the transition plan is really an effective practice. I know that these things don't always occur at the same time, and it's difficult to get everybody at the table, but I think if there's a conversation or a way to share those two documents, there's a lot of overlap with the CCR plan and the transition IEP. So it's really a great practice to have those coordinated and aligned. Also making sure that counselors are able to attend IEP meetings for students ages 14 and older. Counselors can share student career interest inventory or any other kind of assessment. So if you're using U-Science or any kind of career exploration type of assessment, that can be used as a transition assessment. So special ed teachers, case managers are required annually to make sure that they have updated transition assessment information before they develop a student's transition plan. And oftentimes there's information out there that other staff are in the building are conducting with students, such as those career interest inventories, and those can be shared. So make sure that you're collaborating with those special ed case managers. Also becoming familiar with the disability resources, and just to list a few here, such as pre-employment transition services. And if you're not familiar with PREETs, we're going to go over that a little bit later. And also understanding vocational rehabilitation and what it can do for a student, and being familiar with the college disability services centers and how a student would access those supports when they go on to post-secondary settings. Also encouraging students to explore CTE pathways. As we know, CTE students have much higher graduation rates, are engaged in school. We have a lot of comments that we gather from our surveys every summer, and I cannot tell you how many students and families talk about how meaningful it was that their student was involved in CTE pathways and those student organizations that go with CTE, and those work-based learning opportunities really helps set up students for success post-high school. So making sure that we are including students with disabilities in those CTE programs. So just to review and reminder, the purpose of IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is of course to ensure that all students with disabilities have to them available a free and appropriate education that emphasizes special education or related services, but ultimately it is to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living, which right there describes transition, right? I mean, our ultimate goal is to not just get students graduated, but to truly prepare them for success in further education, employment, and independent living. And IDEA talks about that. So IDEA goes on to have really a lot of specific information about transition. There are transition mandates within IDEA. And one of those is the age that transition planning begins. Now, at the federal level, it begins at age 16. But in 2016, Utah changed that, and now we begin transition planning when a student is 14 in Utah. Transition services are a coordinated set of activities. So we want to identify what is the community, the school, the IEP team coordinating to provide the student that is going to help them reach those post-secondary goals successfully. It's also designed to be in a results-oriented process. So what that means is we don't want to just write things on the transition plan, put it away, and not really be held accountable for helping that student actualize their post-secondary goals and make sure that all of these things that we're doing actually help them after they leave high school. It's really designed to help that student move from school to post-school. Life is so different when students leave high school that we really want to make sure that we anticipate what are those skills, experiences, what do the students need to practice to be successful in those post-school settings where things are so different. The IEP doesn't follow the student to college. How are they going to advocate for themselves? So we really want to make sure that we're facilitating that successful movement from school to post-school. And we mentioned this before, but and it all actually says this in the transition mandates that we really want to make sure that we're focusing on a student's strengths, interests, needs, and preferences, and we use the acronym SPINS for that. What are transition services? I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes around what a transition service is. This is outlined in the student's transition plan. And it can be a lot of things. It can be targeted instruction, specially designed instruction. It can be a related service, like teaching the student how to use an assistive technology device, for example, or speech language or mobility. It can be community experiences, the development of employment, and that's everything from writing resumes to actually having work-based learning experiences. It can include other post-school adult living objectives, daily living skills, and functional vocational evaluation. So there's really a lot to transition services that sometimes we overlook. Something that you may or may not be familiar with, but this is also in our Utah special education rules, that students with disabilities must have access to school counselors for the purpose of planning. And also must be invited and included in school activities which address the course planning, including college week, scholarships, ACT. And I think the reason this was added to our special ed rules specifically in Utah is that we were finding that in some schools, students with disabilities didn't have direct access to counselors, and maybe their special ed teacher case manager was sort of taking on that role. And we want to make sure that we recognize that counselors have a lot of expertise to bring to the table that a special ed teacher may not have. So we want to make sure that all students with disabilities have access to those same activities and services from our school counselors. So a student's IEP or transition plan is embedded in their IEP. And it really should be not just this page to fill out and boxes to check, but really a process. And I believe it's a powerful process and tool if done correctly. And so we like to use this colorful flow chart to really kind of highlight and show the process that transition should follow, starting at the top with some really ongoing rich information, transition assessment information about the student's strengths, interests, preference, and needs. Then there are those post-secondary goals that are developed, and those are goals for the student after they leave the LEA. And then we identify the transition services. That's the blue in the middle. We just talked about that. What are those experiences, instruction, related services, employment, adult living, all of that kind of rich specially designed, individualized kinds of services that a student would benefit from. And then from that, what are the course of study? What is the course of study that the student would need to reach those post-secondary goals? And that's, I think, especially where that alignment comes in with the CCR plan, is making sure that the student is really mapping out that course of study so that they can successfully reach their post-secondary goal for employment and or further education and training. And then, of course, we have the annual IEP goals. And then at the end, that coordination with outside adult agency services. I think that families really do rely on schools to have those relationships with those representatives from outside agencies to make sure that there's that seamless connection. It's difficult oftentimes for students and families to navigate all of these different services after they leave. So we want to make sure there's that overlap of those services before a student leaves high school. All right, a few other things that you may or may not be familiar with that we have in Utah, specific to students with disabilities, really designed to improve those outcomes, is the Utah Career Development Credential. I'm going to go into a little more depth about that if you're not familiar with it. We'll also talk about the alternate diploma for students with significant cognitive disabilities. You'll want to be aware of that. And I mentioned before pre-employment transition services, and I'll go through an explanation of what those are and how to access them, and then vocational rehabilitation services, which are available to most students with disabilities. So Utah's Career Development Credential. So this passed in our board in 2018. It is a career-focused work experience credential, much like a CTE certificate or pathway completion, for example. The Utah Career Development Credential is available for students that have an IEP, but also students that are on a 504 plan. It is not a diploma. It is, like I mentioned, a credential that can be earned alongside a regular high school diploma or an alternate diploma. The CDC, as we like to call it, is designed to prepare students for the workforce and a focused career path, work experience, and transition skills. So essentially, I'll show you the components of what's all involved in this career development credential, but we essentially kind of took what we know is evidence-based practices and kind of rolled it into this career development credential. And it really is designed to have students with disabilities leave our schools with kind of this rich skill base and experience and the linkages to outside agencies, so that really setting them up for success for employment and further education. So what's required for the career development credentials? Well, completion of 120 hours of community-based work experiences. So that can be job shadowing, internships, apprenticeships, paid internships, work experience. Also, of the 120 hours, 40 hours of paid employment is also required for the career development credential. We recognize that sometimes this is difficult for LEAs to ensure that a student has 40 hours of paid employment. So if that is not possible, then we want to make sure that that we have documentation that the student has connected and enrolled with either vocational rehabilitation or the Department of Workforce Services. So we know that they're connected with an outside agency that's going to help them access employment and paid employment. The career development credential requires that a student has a concentration in a CTE pathway, and along with that, a half credit or a semester of work-based learning internship. The other part of the requirement of the career development credential is that the student has had some instruction in a curriculum coursework or class. There's not a requirement of hours or credits, but just that a student has had some instruction around disability awareness, accommodations, and the different laws that affect them in the workplace and in post-secondary settings, such as 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Also recognizing that self-advocacy instruction is very important, and career exploration and workplace soft skills. So we know these are all evidence-based predictors that if students have some access and instruction in these areas, that they are just better equipped to be successful in their post-secondary settings. So just to kind of highlight some alignments with the career development credential and other things that are going on at the federal level and the state level. You're probably familiar with the new authorization of the Perkins Act and how there's a lot of specific language in Perkins that talks about supporting students with disabilities in CTE programs. And we feel that this career development really kind of helps support and align that. Concentration in CT pathways, we know improves graduation and employment rates for students with disabilities. We also know that our graduation and dropout rates for students with disabilities is lagging behind their non-disabled peers. So we want to make sure that we obviously are increasing grad rate for our students with disabilities and decreasing dropout rates. It aligns with evidence-based predictors of post-school success and transition, and I'm going to go through that in just a minute. And the career development credential really aligns with the components of the transition plan. So for example, the coursework around the transition curriculum can fit nicely into those transition services for a student on their plan. And then if you are or are not familiar with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, also known as WIOA, it aligns with those mandates within WIOA called pre-employment transition services. And I'm going to highlight those in a minute, and you'll see kind of the alignment between the career development credential on that. So essentially, like I mentioned, we're kind of looking at what are those evidence-based predictors that are going to help students succeed. And we created the CDC to support those. So some considerations there. I have to say there's not a lot of LEAs that are awarding or encouraging students to earn the CDC. And I think it's simply because the word hasn't necessarily gotten to the practitioner level yet. And what will it require? Well, LEAs need to work closely with CTE staff to provide access and accommodations for students with disabilities. So it definitely takes some collaboration. Determine how to provide those work-based learning opportunities. Who's going to support the student in a CTE work-based learning opportunity? I think there needs to be discussions about where and how and what exactly that transition curriculum is going to look like and who's going to deliver it. It can be embedded in classes. It can be a separate transition curriculum class. That is really up to the LEA. And LEAs need to collect and collaborate also with their outside agencies. So specifically vocational rehabilitation counselors. They can bring a lot of things to the table, such as work-based learning opportunities and different services. And then determining also the person that oversees 504 students and how are we going to make sure that 504 students have access to the career development credential and some of these other services that can benefit students. All right, I'm moving on to graduation guidelines. So another document that we just updated is that link at the top. It's called the USBE Graduation Guidelines for Students with Disabilities. And it's a document that really talks about all of these things listed here, the difference between diplomas and certificates, how to modify graduation requirements, and what is the guidance around that for IEP teams. How does a student with a disability have access to the civics test? Students with disabilities that are in adult ed or pursuing their GED. It also talks about graduation calculation and how that impacts. There's lots of different ways to calculate graduation, including our special education graduation calculations. So there's very specific information on that, how to code students correctly and how that impacts those graduation rates. And then there's frequently asked questions about graduation as well in the context of students with disabilities. So if you're not familiar with this document, I'll put the chat or the link in the chat in a minute, but also I'll make sure that everybody has this PowerPoint when I send it to Bethany after my presentation. So that's there for you. A little bit more about the Utah's alternate diploma. Again, you may or may not be familiar, but in 2018, the board passed the Utah alternate diploma. So this is something that was allowable under the ESSA law, the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is not from IDEA. There are about half of the states in, excuse me, in our country that have decided to have an alternate diploma, and Utah is one of them. And I think first and foremost, what we need to remember is that the alternate diploma is only for students with significant cognitive disabilities. And those are students that access core standards through the essential elements. And these are students that are also assessed on the alternate standards through the DLM, and they are flagged 1% in our system. So that has to happen first before we can determine that a student can be on path to earn the alternate diploma. Graduation requirements for the alternate diploma are aligned with a regular high school diploma in terms of the courses and the number of credits a student needs to earn. Obviously, under recognizing that there may be modifications and substitutions, and that is up to the IEP team to determine. The reason that the stakeholders felt that Utah should have the alternate diploma is that it had increased rigor. So oftentimes students with significant cognitive disabilities leave our schools with certificates of completion, which have no criteria. But the alternate diploma has more rigor and more criteria. And when we felt that students with significant cognitive disabilities needed that. The alternate diploma also does count in state and federal cohort graduation rates, but not in our special education indicator 1 graduation rate. So where it gets a little confusing, but it does count in our state accountability and our cohort graduation rates. So for more information on both the career development credential and the alternate diploma, we have frequently asked questions documents and other resources at this link here. And again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint in just a little bit. All right, so what are pre-employment transition services? You may or may not be familiar with them. They've been around since 2014 when the law was passed. It really didn't kind of hit the ground running in our state until about 2017. But essentially, pre-employment transition services are funded through our vocational rehabilitation system. They actually have to set aside 15% of their federal funds, which actually is a lot. And typically every year we don't spend all that we have. So we always want to get the word out that these services are available to students ages 14 to 21, and they are available to any student that has a documented disability. So that means obviously a student on an IEP, a student on a 504 plan, but even a student that doesn't have either of those plans, but still has some documentation that they have a disability, can be eligible to receive pre-employment transition services. So you might be wondering, where are these provided? Who provides them? There are 15 outside providers throughout our state. And there are also 15 pre-ETS instructors, and they are kind of like a paraeducator to a vocational rehabilitation counselor. They work directly out of our district offices in the state. And their main job is to connect with schools and teach job readiness workshops and help students connect to vocational rehabilitation and actually apply for services. So pre-ETS, you kind of can think of it as like the light app version or a light touch. So it is short instruction and experiences for a student. If they need more intensive supports, then they would want to apply to become a vocational rehabilitation client. The last link there, and again, I'll put that in the chat, there's a really nice brochure that USOR has put together that kind of maps out all of the providers in the state, how to connect with those providers, and an explanation of what those services can look like for students. There are 5 core services within pre-ETS, and they are job exploration counseling, work-based learning, and that can be everything from job shadowing to actual internships, paid or unpaid. Then there's counseling on post-secondary opportunities. So a student can have somebody go tour colleges, go tour disability resource centers, help them with the FAFSA. It's kind of more additional one-on-one support around how students can explore and access post-secondary opportunities. Workplace readiness, a lot of that is done through those job readiness workshops that I mentioned that pre-ETS instructors are actually teaching in our schools. And then instruction on self-advocacy, because we know how important that is for a student with a disability to understand their disability, what accommodations they need, and be able to advocate for themselves in those post-school settings. So those are the 5 core services. They can be delivered in lots of different ways. They are, first and foremost, no cost to a student, a family, or an LEA. They can be delivered individually or in a group. They can happen in the school, outside of the school. We have summer programs. Sometimes it's after school. It really depends upon the student's needs and the area of the state. And then referrals, of course, can be made to connect a student to these services by a parent, by a school counselor, teachers, 504 coordinators. The student themselves can also initiate that. Of course, if they're under 18, they'll need parent permission, but that's how they would connect. So I mentioned before that there's been a lot of research around what kinds of evidence-based practices really predict a student with a disability's success after high school. And this is the list. So there's a lot on there. The red that I've highlighted, I like to say, is kind of the most bang for your buck. So these are just really important indicators and predictors of student success. So making sure that students have access to general education typically produces better post-school outcomes. The paid work experience, I cannot stress that enough. That is really a huge predictor of whether or not a student will work after they leave school. Again, that self-advocacy and self-determination being super important no matter what the student's disability. Those CTE pathways and work-based learning experiences are kind of the biggies, and that's why I've highlighted those. So we have a number of Padlets that we have available with lots of information around the career development credential. We've also developed a transition planning app. So this is an app that a student can access on a phone or a Padlet, also on a computer, of course, where they can enter in information about themselves, and actually it creates a draft plan that they can bring to their transition IEP. So it essentially follows all the components of the transition plan itself, and a student can then drive their transition IEP, be more involved, take ownership through that app. And that Padlet really has a demo video and lots of information about how to access the app. We also have a Padlet that is all about building local transition teams. We know that if schools or LEAs have interagency transition teams talking about how they can help support a student, the better outcomes we have with our students. So we have developed a tool and lots of resources for local, either site-based teams, so at a school, or LEA-based teams. And how do we effectively make sure that we're providing students those rich experiences and opportunities to set them up for success? And then we have another Padlet that's specific to transition assessment. So if you're interested in looking at all the variety of transition assessments we have out there, we've organized those in a Padlet. Now, unfortunately, we can't put any of these Padlet links on our website. So that's why we have created these outside Padlets. But when you have this PowerPoint, you'll have access to all of those. We have more, but I didn't want to overwhelm you. But if you are looking for something else, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm sure I can find that resource for you. So I want to pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions. And if not, I am curious if maybe your level of knowledge around transition has increased at all since the beginning of our presentation today. And with that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email or phone. If you have a particular situation or question, or you need more resources, I'd be happy to help you. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Lavinia. I know I learned a lot, and I feel like I know quite a bit. So thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, when you send that to me, I will put that in the Google Drive, everybody, so you have access to those resources and that information.